The howl of wolves tore through the frigid Dakota night. Their eerie cries echoed across a wilderness of endless, unforgiving snow. It was a sound that could freeze a man's blood, but it wasn't the wolves that made Hannah Sinclair's heart hammer against her ribs. No, it was something far worse. Peering through the frost-rimmed window of her tiny cabin, she saw them. 4 men on horseback, emerging like dark specters from the swirling snow, their breath clouding in the bitter cold. They moved with a purpose that chilled her to the bone, and not a single one of them was her husband, Nathan. Hannah lurched back from the window, her hand flying to her mouth to muffle the sound of her own ragged breathing. Her other arm tightened around her sleeping infant daughter, Grace, holding her close against her chest. The baby stirred, a soft little murmur in the terrifying silence, but mercifully, she stayed asleep. The cabin was a crude thing, little more than a box of rough-hewn logs Nathan had thrown together when they'd first arrived in this godforsaken territory 3 months ago. It offered almost no place to hide, but she had to find one. The men were less than 50 yards away now, their horses trudging through snow that came up to their knees. Their dark coats blended with the night, making them look like headless riders from a nightmare. With swift, silent movements born of pure desperation, Hannah reached for the oil lamp on the table. She pinched the wick, plunging the cabin into near-total darkness, save for the dying orange glow of the embers in the hearth. She gently, so gently, placed Grace into a large wicker basket she used for laundry. She piled blankets on top, leaving just enough space for air. Then, sliding it on the dirt floor, she pushed the basket deep under the crude table. From a hook by the door, she took down Nathan's hunting knife. Its long steel blade gleamed dully in the faint firelight. It felt heavy and unfamiliar in her hand. Hannah positioned herself in the deepest shadows beside the door, the knife gripped so tightly her knuckles were white. Her fingers trembled, but her resolve was like iron. She would not let them touch her child. She waited. The crunch of heavy boots on snow grew louder, closer. Then came their voices, rough and low, cutting through the thin wooden walls and the howl of the wind. "This has to be it. Only cabin for miles around." "Don't look like much. You sure this is where Sinclair would hide it?" "Man's got a wife and a baby. It's the perfect cover." Then, a sound that made her jump out of her skin. A heavy fist pounded against the door, the wood groaning in protest. "Hello inside. Anyone home?" Hannah remained absolutely silent, holding her breath until her lungs burned. She was a statue carved from shadow and fear. Another voice, deeper and meaner than the others, rumbled from outside. "Kick it in, boys. If they're sleeping, they're about to get a real rude awakening." The door didn't just open. It exploded inward. A sickening crack of splintering wood echoed through the small room as the door flew off its leather hinges. Frigid air rushed in like an invading army, carrying with it the smell of horses, stale tobacco, and unwashed bodies. 4 massive shapes stomped inside, shaking snow from their boots. In the faint light from the dying embers, Hannah could make out their snow-crusted beards, the hungry look in their eyes, and the menacing gleam of pistols holstered at their hips. One of them, a tall man with a wicked scar that ran from his temple all the way down to his jaw, moved to stir the fire. As the flames leaped up, casting jagged, dancing shadows across the walls, another man spotted her. He saw her huddled in the corner, a predator spotting its cornered prey. "Well, well," he said, his lips curling into a smile that never came close to reaching his cold, dead eyes. "Look what we found, boys." The scarred man turned his gaze on her, his eyes traveling from Hannah's terrified face down to the long hunting knife clutched in her hand. He didn't look scared. He looked amused. He let out a low, gravelly laugh. "Planning to gut all 4 of us with that little pig sticker, ma'am?" Hannah lifted her chin, fighting a battle to keep her voice from trembling. "This is private property. You need to leave. Now." The scarred man chuckled again, turning to his companions. "Hear that, boys? The lady says we need to leave." His expression suddenly hardened, the humor vanishing like a puff of smoke. His face became a mask of pure menace. "Where is Nathan Sinclair?" A cold wave of fear, so intense it was almost paralyzing, washed over Hannah. But she forced herself to stand taller, to meet his gaze. "My husband. He's out hunting. He'll be back any minute." The third man, shorter than the others but with the coiled tension of a rattlesnake and the cold eyes of a killer, let out a snort of derision. "Hunting? For 2 weeks straight? Your man's long gone, lady. Took the gold and ran." "Gold?" Hannah's confusion was genuine, and it must have shown on her face. "What gold? I don't know what you're talking about." The men exchanged quick, uncertain glances. The fourth man, who had remained silent in the back until now, stepped forward. Unlike the others, he wasn't just a brute. There was a sharp, dangerous intelligence in his gaze that somehow made him the most frightening of them all. "You're Hannah Sinclair," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Wife of Nathan Sinclair, the prospector who struck it rich in Snake Valley. Hannah's mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Nathan had never, not once, mentioned Snake Valley. He'd never mentioned any gold strike. Her husband had been obsessed with finding gold since they'd left Virginia, a fever that had driven them to this desolate land. But all his expeditions had ended in disappointment and mounting debt. "You have the wrong man," she said, her voice firm, defying the terror that was screaming inside her. "My husband hasn't found any gold. We have nothing." The intelligent man studied her face, his eyes narrowed, searching for any hint of a lie. He seemed to find none. He turned to the others. "She doesn't know." Then he turned back to Hannah, a thin, cruel smile playing on his lips. "Interesting. Your husband didn't tell his own wife about the biggest gold strike in the entire Dakota Territory." "Because there was no strike," Hannah insisted, her voice rising. And that's when it happened. A thin, reedy wail rose from beneath the table. Hannah's blood turned to ice. Grace. She was awake. The scarred man's head snapped toward the sound, his eyes wide. "What in the hell was that?" Before Hannah could move, before she could even scream, the short, vicious man acted. With a single violent motion, he kicked the table over. It flipped through the air, crashing against the far wall. And there, exposed in the flickering firelight, was the wicker basket and its precious contents. Grace's cries grew louder, sharper, fueled by the sudden noise and chaos. "Well now, ain't that sweet?" the scarred man sneered, taking a step toward the basket. "A little Sinclair." A primal rage erupted inside Hannah, hotter and brighter than any fear. She lunged forward, the hunting knife raised high. "Don't you touch her!" She never made it. The short man caught her wrist in a grip of iron, twisting with brutal force until the knife clattered uselessly to the dirt floor. He shoved her hard against the cabin wall, his foul, liquor-laced breath hot on her face. "Where's the gold, woman? Where did Nathan hide it before he ran out on you?" "I told you there is no gold," Hannah gasped, struggling against his hold, the rough logs scraping her back. Then she saw the intelligent man. He had walked over to the basket. He reached down and picked up her crying baby, holding her with a chilling clinical detachment, as if she were an object, a piece of evidence. "She's a pretty child," he said, his voice soft, almost conversational, which made the threat behind his words 1,000 times worse. "Be a real shame if something happened to her." That was it. The fight went out of her, replaced by a cold, bottomless dread. All her pretense of strength crumbled into dust. "Please," Hannah whispered, her voice breaking. Tears streamed down her face. "She's just a baby. Whatever you want, if I can give it to you, I will. Just please, don't hurt my daughter." And in that exact moment, a single gunshot cracked through the night. It was so loud, so close, it seemed to shake the very walls of the cabin. The men froze, every one of them. Their heads whipped toward the shattered doorway, their confidence suddenly gone, replaced by alarm. Hannah seized the moment of uncertainty, her mind racing. "That'll be my husband," she bluffed, her voice ringing with a conviction she did not feel. "And he won't be alone." As if on cue, another shot rang out, followed by a man's sharp shout from the darkness outside. "Riders coming!" the scarred man hissed, his eyes wide with panic. "Back door! Now!" The intelligent man looked from Hannah to the baby in his arms. For a split second, she thought he might take Grace with him. But then, with surprising gentleness, he set her back down in her basket. "We'll be back, Mrs. Sinclair," he said softly, his eyes locking onto hers with a promise that made her shiver. "And when we do, you'd better have some answers about that gold." They fled through the small rear door, vanishing into the storm as quickly as they had appeared. Just as their footsteps faded, Hannah heard the sound of more horses approaching from the front. She scrambled across the floor, snatched up Grace, and clutched her to her chest. The baby's terrified cries slowly subsided into hiccuping sobs against her mother's shoulder. Hannah grabbed the fallen hunting knife again, her knuckles white. She waited, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, as the newcomer's footsteps crunched through the snow toward the broken doorway. When a silhouette appeared in the opening, she nearly collapsed with a wave of dizzying relief. It wasn't Nathan. It was Samuel Blackwood, a grizzled man in his 60s, with a face as weathered as the Dakota landscape itself. He ran the trading post 20 miles to the east. He stood framed in the doorway, a heavy rifle in his hand. Behind him stood one of his Lakota companions, also armed. "Mrs. Sinclair." Samuel nodded, his sharp eyes quickly taking in the scene, the upturned furniture, the broken door, the terror on her face. "You all right?" "You're hurt." Only then did Hannah notice the warm trickle of blood running down her arm where the short man had gripped her. The skin was broken. "I'm fine," she said, her voice shaky. "Thank God you came when you did. They were going to hurt my baby." Samuel holstered his rifle, his expression grim. "Wasn't God, ma'am. Was your husband's letter. Said you might need checking on." Hannah's relief curdled into a new, sharp confusion. "A letter? When?" "Got it yesterday. Said he had business that would keep him away longer than expected. Said to look in on you and the little one." Samuel's eyes narrowed as he scanned the ransacked cabin. "Those men, they were looking for Nathan, weren't they?" Hannah sank onto a stool, the adrenaline finally leaving her, making her feel weak and exhausted. "Yes. They said something about gold, in a place called Snake Valley. They said Nathan found a huge strike." She looked up at the old trader, her eyes pleading for an answer. "Samuel, is it true?" Samuel and his companion exchanged a long, meaningful look. The old man let out a heavy sigh, running a hand over his weary face. "There's been talk, Hannah, big talk, the kind that gets men killed." His gaze was serious and filled with a deep concern. If Nathan really found that much gold, he'd have more than just friends. He'd have enemies, the kind of men who'd kill for that kind of wealth. Hannah looked down at Grace, now sleeping peacefully against her chest, oblivious to the danger. A cold dread settled in her stomach. "They'll be back," she whispered. It wasn't a guess. It was a certainty. She'd seen it in their leader's eyes. "They threatened my baby." "Which is why you can't stay here," Samuel said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "A storm's coming in fast, worst of the season by the look of it. You need to pack whatever you can carry. We're leaving. Now." "To the trading post?" she asked, a flicker of hope igniting. Samuel shook his head grimly. "Not safe enough. If those men are smart, that's the first place they'll look." He hesitated for a moment, thinking. "But I know a place. A man who owns a ranch south of here. A good man. He'll give you shelter until this blows over." or until Nathan returns. Hannah looked around the tiny one-room cabin that had been her home for the past 3 months. It had never felt like much, but it was all she and Grace had. Now even this small, fragile security was being stripped away from them. "How far is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "A day's ride in good weather," Samuel said. "Longer in this snow, a lot longer." Hannah thought of the men's faces, the scarred one's sneer, the short one's brutal grip, the intelligent one's cold, calculating eyes as he held her daughter. There was no choice. Not really. "We need to leave now," she said, her voice finding a new strength. Samuel nodded, a look of approval on his weathered face. "Pack light. Just the essentials. We need to move fast." As Hannah gathered their meager belongings, a few spare clothes, Grace's blankets, the family Bible, Samuel and his companion worked to wedge the broken door back into its frame, a temporary fix against the worsening storm. Outside, the wind had picked up, howling like a hungry beast, driving snow against the windows in tiny crystalline clicks. "Storm's getting worse by the minute," Samuel warned from the doorway. "We need to move." Hannah wrapped Grace in layer after layer of warm blankets, then secured her inside her own heavy coat, close to her body heat. As she made one final sweep of the cabin, her foot caught on something, a loose floorboard near the hearth. It shifted under her weight, revealing a small, dark space beneath. Something white caught her eye, the corner of a piece of paper. Glancing over her shoulder to make sure Samuel was still outside, Hannah knelt down. She worked her cold fingers into the narrow gap, her heart suddenly pounding for a reason she didn't understand. She pulled out a folded letter. Her name was written on it, in Nathan's familiar hurried scrawl. With trembling fingers, she unfolded it. The firelight flickered, and she began to read. "My dearest Hannah, if you are reading this, then something has gone terribly wrong. I never meant for any of this to happen. The truth is, I have lied to you. From the very beginning." Hannah's breath caught in her throat. She read on, the words blurring through a sudden film of tears. "I already had a wife, Hannah, in St. Louis. When I met you, I was already married. I used your dowry money to fund my prospecting trips. I am not the man you thought I was." The room seemed to tilt. The roar in her ears was louder than the storm outside. A wife in St. Louis, a wife. The words didn't make sense. Her entire world, the foundation of her life, was crumbling to dust beneath her feet. "But I found something real this time. Gold, Hannah, in Snake Valley. More than you can imagine. Enough to set us up for life. Enough to make amends for the man I've been. I will be back for you and Grace as soon as I can arrange safe transport. But there are dangerous men after this claim. If I do not return within 2 weeks of leaving, take Grace and go to Samuel Blackwood at the trading post. He has instructions to help you. If, God forbid, Samuel cannot be found, there is a man named Jackson Reed. He owns a ranch a day's ride south of here. The enclosed map will lead you there. Reed is a good man. He owes me a favor from our days in the war. He will keep you safe. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I hope someday you can understand. In my own broken way, I did love you. Nathan." Hannah stared at the letter, her blood roaring in her ears. A wife. All of it a lie. The whole thing. The room spun around her as memories rearranged themselves into a new, horrifying pattern. The unexplained absences he'd blamed on prospecting trips, the evasive answers about his past, the money from her family that had simply disappeared. She had abandoned her own family, her home, her reputation, everything she knew and loved, for a man who had been deceiving her from the moment they met. She was not his wife. She was his mistake. Grace was... What was Grace? Footsteps approached the door. Hannah hastily folded the letter, tucking it and the small, hand-drawn map that fell out of it deep into her dress pocket. "Ready to go?" Samuel asked, appearing in the doorway, his face etched with worry. Hannah nodded, unable to trust her voice. Her world had just been shattered into a million pieces, but there was no time to mourn it. There was no time to scream, no time to cry. Grace needed her. Grace needed her to be strong, and so she would be. Outside, the storm had unleashed its full fury. Snow fell in thick, blinding curtains, and the wind cut through Hannah's coat like a shard of glass. Samuel helped her onto her horse, checking to make sure Grace was secure and sheltered within her coat. "Stay close!" he shouted over the roar of the wind. "Follow my tracks exactly! Don't get separated!" They set out into the blinding white, a tiny, desperate caravan against the immense power of the storm. They left behind the cabin, the only home Hannah and Grace had ever known in this harsh, unforgiving territory. The only home she'd ever shared with the man who was, she now knew, a complete stranger. The cold was bone deep, a physical pain that seemed to suck the very life out of her. Within minutes, Hannah couldn't feel her fingers or her toes. Grace began to whimper against her chest, sensing her mother's silent, desperate distress. "It's all right, sweet girl," Hannah whispered, though the wind tore the words from her lips and flung them into the screaming void. "Mama's here. Mama will keep you safe." She repeated it like a prayer, a mantra against the cold and the crushing weight of Nathan's betrayal. Hour after grueling hour, they pushed through the storm. The world narrowed to a small, suffocating bubble of existence. There was only Hannah, Grace, the horse beneath them, and the shadowy, increasingly obscured figure of Samuel riding ahead. Then, disaster. Her horse stumbled in a deep, hidden snowdrift, pitching forward so suddenly that Hannah was thrown against the pommel. She nearly lost her grip on Grace. She cried out, a raw sound of terror. Samuel's Lakota companion was by her side in an instant, his own horse sure-footed, his hand reaching out to steady her mount. The man's face, barely visible through the swirling snow, was grave. "Too dangerous," he said, his English halting but clear. "Need shelter, now." Samuel appeared out of the white chaos, his face grim. "He's right. There's an old trapper's cabin about a mile ahead. We can try to wait out the worst of it there." Hannah could only nod, numbly. She was no longer able to form words through her chattering teeth. Grace had stopped crying, which somehow terrified her more than anything. A quiet baby in this cold was a bad sign. A very bad sign. She fumbled with the buttons of her coat, her fingers clumsy and useless. She had to see her daughter's face. When she finally managed to pull the fabric aside, her heart stopped. Grace's cheeks were alarmingly pale, her lips tinged with a faint, terrifying blue. "My baby," Hannah managed to choke out, the words turning to ice in the air. She's too cold." Samuel leaned over from his horse, peering at the infant. He wasted no time. He made a quick, decisive decision. "Give her to me. I can keep her warmer." Hannah hesitated for just a single, selfish moment, unwilling to let her precious bundle go. But one look at Grace's pale face told her she had no choice. She surrendered her daughter into Samuel's strong, steady hands. He expertly tucked Grace inside his own heavy buffalo hide coat, against the warmth of his chest. "Keep moving," he ordered, his voice a raw command against the storm. "Stay alive for your daughter, Hannah. Just stay alive." They pressed on, but Hannah's strength was failing. The bitter cold had seeped into her bones, into her soul, and a profound exhaustion was pulling at her like quicksand. Twice she swayed in the saddle, nearly falling, saved only by the Lakota man riding close beside her, a silent, steady guardian. When the cabin finally appeared, a dark, blessedly solid smudge against the endless, swirling white, it seemed like a mirage, a cruel trick of her freezing mind. Hannah was beyond relief, beyond feeling anything but the mechanical effort of staying upright. Samuel dismounted, still cradling Grace, and kicked the cabin's dilapidated door open, Inside was dark, musty, and smelled of old smoke and damp earth. But it was out of the wind. His companion immediately set about building a fire in the crude stone hearth, while Samuel laid Grace on a dusty pile of old furs. He began rubbing her tiny, cold limbs, trying to bring life back into them. "How is she?" Hannah asked, her voice a raw rasp as she collapsed onto the floor beside her daughter. "She's a fighter," Samuel said, his weathered face softening as Grace's eyes fluttered open. A tiny, weak cry escaped her lips, just like her mother. The fire caught, and blessed, life-giving heat began to push back the killing cold. As feeling painfully returned to her own extremities in a wave of pins and needles, Hannah gathered Grace into her arms, checking every inch of her for frostbite. The baby was cold, so cold, but she was alert. Her perfect little fingers flexed as the warmth returned. "Thank God," Hannah whispered, pressing her lips to Grace's forehead, a single hot tear splashing onto the baby's cheek. "Rest now," Samuel said, spreading out his own bedroll for her on the floor. "This storm might last for days. We need to conserve our strength." Hannah settled onto the bedroll with Grace clutched to her chest. Despite the hurricane of betrayal and fear raging in her mind, utter exhaustion claimed her almost immediately. She dreamed of Nathan. She dreamed of his easy smile when he'd first approached her after church back in Virginia, all charm and promises. She dreamed of their hasty wedding, of her father's disapproving scowl and her mother's quiet tears. She dreamed of the long, hopeful journey west, filled with his talk of a new life, a future built just for them. Then the dream shifted, turning dark and cold. Nathan was walking away from her, across an endless field of snow, but he wasn't alone. Another woman was at his side, a woman with a smug, smiling face. They were both laughing at Hannah as she struggled to follow, with Grace growing heavier and heavier in her arms with each desperate step. Hannah woke with a gasp, disoriented in the dim, unfamiliar light of the trapper's cabin. The fire had burned low. Outside, the storm still raged, a monstrous living thing. Samuel and his companion were conferring in low voices by the door. How long have I slept?" she asked, her voice thick and scratchy. "A few hours," Samuel replied, turning to face her. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by horses," Hannah admitted, shifting Grace to a more comfortable position. The baby was awake, but quiet now, her wide, solemn eyes watching the firelight dance on the ceiling. Samuel brought her a cup of hot, black coffee from a pot they'd hung over the fire. It was bitter and burned going down, but the warmth was a balm. "Storm's not letting up," he said grimly. "Looks like we'll have to stay put for another day at least." Hannah nodded, taking another sip of the brew. She had to ask. She had to know if he was part of the lie, too. "Samuel," she said after a long moment of silence, "did you know about Nathan's other wife?" The old man's face registered genuine, unfeigned surprise. He looked truly shocked. "Other wife? What in God's name are you talking about, Hannah?" "He wrote it. In a letter I found hidden in our cabin. He said he had a wife. In St. Louis." Samuel's expression darkened, the surprise replaced by a slow burning anger. He shook his head. "That man, Nathan Sinclair, has a real talent for complicating lives, it seems." "The men who came to the cabin?" Hannah said, her mind working through the terrible new implications. "If they're looking for him because of this stolen gold, will they hunt us too?" "That," Samuel said, his voice grave, "is exactly why we're not going to the trading post. It's too obvious. This Jackson Reed's ranch is remote. Those men, they won't know about Nathan's connection to him." Hannah pulled the crumpled map from her pocket, unfolding it with care. The paper was cheap, the ink faded, but the route was clearly marked. A path leading south from their current position to a spot labeled simply, Reed Ranch. "Who is this Jackson Reed?" she asked. "Really?" Former army surgeon, Samuel said, stoking the fire. Turned rancher. Keeps to himself, mostly. Has a couple working for him, the Coopers. Good folks. Reed knew Nathan during the war. Saved his life after Antietam, so the story goes. Hannah tried to reconcile this information with the man she thought she knew. Nathan rarely, if ever, spoke of his time in the war. He always deflected questions with a quick joke or a change of the subject. Another secret. Another lie in a mountain of them. Will he help us? A woman and a child he's never even met? Samuel's stern eyes softened for a moment. He's a good man, Hannah. A better man than most. He'll help. The storm continued to rage through the night and all through the next day, imprisoning them in the tiny, dark cabin. By the second night, their meager provisions were running dangerously low. Worse, Grace was growing fussy, hungry, and weak without proper milk. We can't wait any longer, Hannah decided, as a gray, reluctant dawn broke on the third day. The wind had died down somewhat, though the snow still fell. Grace needs proper food and warmth. We have to go. Samuel studied the grim gray sky through the cabin's single grimy window. It's risky. But you're right. The little one needs better care than we can give her here. They packed quickly, a desperate urgency propelling Hannah's movements. The cold hit them like a physical blow as they stepped outside, but the reduced visibility from the falling snow was a blessing in disguise. It would make them harder to track if the men from the cabin were out there, searching. The going was painfully, brutally slow. The horses struggled through fresh snow that in some places reached past their knees. More than once, they had to dismount and lead the exhausted animals around drifts that were taller than they were. Grace, tucked safely inside Hannah's coat again, remained eerily quiet, conserving what little energy she had left. By midday, Hannah was lightheaded with exhaustion and hunger. They paused for a few minutes to eat the last of their dried jerky, Samuel insisting that Hannah take the larger portion. You need your strength for the baby, he said gruffly, refusing her attempts to share it equally. They had just remounted their horses when it happened. Samuel's companion, who had been scouting a short distance ahead, came galloping back, his face a mask of urgency. Riders, he said, the single word hanging in the cold air like a death sentence. 3 of them, coming this way, fast. Samuel's face hardened into granite. Could be a coincidence, he said, but his tone said he didn't believe it for a second. Or it could be those men from your cabin tracked us somehow. What do we do? Hannah asked, her heart racing, pounding a frantic drum of terror against her ribs. We split up, Samuel said without hesitation. His eyes were sharp, calculating. You take the map. You continue south. See that ridge over there? He pointed to a low line of hills, perhaps half a mile distant. It'll block their view of you. My friend and I will lead them east. We'll make them think we're all heading for the trading post. But you'll be in danger! We know this country better than they do. Samuel cut her off, his voice sharp. We'll lose them in the canyons and circle back. Don't you worry about us. You just focus on one thing, and one thing only, getting Grace to Reed's ranch. Hannah wanted to argue, to protest, but then Grace stirred restlessly against her chest, a small, fragile weight that reminded her of what was truly at stake, her daughter's life. Thank you, she said simply, the words feeling utterly inadequate. For everything. Samuel just nodded, then reached into one of his saddlebags and pulled out a heavy, steel-framed revolver. He pushed it into her hand. Take this. It's got 6 shots. Make them count, if you have to. Hannah tucked the cold, heavy weapon into her coat pocket, praying to a god she wasn't sure was listening that she wouldn't have to use it. With a final, grateful nod to both men, she turned her horse south and urged it toward the distant ridge, keeping low in the saddle. She didn't look back, not until she reached the relative shelter of the hills. From there, she risked a single glance over her shoulder. In the distance, she could just make out 2 dark figures on horseback, riding hard to the east, and behind them, gaining fast, were 3 other dark figures in pursuit. Hannah sent up a silent, desperate prayer for their safety. Then she pulled out Nathan's crumpled map. According to the crude drawing, Reed's ranch lay another 10 miles south. 10 miles. In good conditions, a few hours' ride. But in this snow, with her exhaustion, it was an impossible distance. It would be a miracle if she arrived before dawn. "Just a little longer, Grace," she whispered to the precious bundle hidden in her coat. "Just hold on, my love. Just a little longer." Hour after hour, Hannah pushed relentlessly forward. The snow had finally stopped falling, but as night approached, the temperature began to plummet. The vast, empty, white landscape seemed to swallow her whole. It was an alien world, broken only by the occasional stunted tree or dark, rocky outcropping that looked like the bones of some long-dead monster. As darkness fell completely, a bone-deep cold settled over the land, a cold that felt ancient and malevolent. Hannah's horse plodded onward, its head low, plumes of steam rising from its nostrils in the frigid air. Inside her coat, Grace had begun to whimper again, a weak, pitiful sound that tore at Hannah's heart and frayed her last remaining nerve. "Hush now, sweet girl," she murmured, though her own lips were so numb she could barely form the words. "We're almost there. We have to be." But they weren't almost there. The landmarks on the map, a split rock, a lightning-scarred tree, were all buried deep under the snow. In the disorienting darkness, Hannah could only guess at their direction, praying she was still heading south. Then the horse stumbled for the 3rd time in as many minutes. It was too exhausted to go on with her on its back. Hannah was forced to dismount, her legs buckling under her as she landed in snow that came halfway up her calves. She grabbed the reins and began to lead the animal, trudging through the deep, clinging snow. She was so cold, so tired. Every single step required a monumental effort of will. Her thoughts began to fracture, to drift. She found herself thinking of her father's warm house back in Virginia, the comforting scent of the kitchen on baking days, the sweet smell of her mother's roses in the summer sun. It all felt like a lifetime ago, like a story someone else had lived. She stumbled, falling face first into a deep drift of soft, powdery snow. For a long moment, Hannah didn't even try to get up. The cold was almost pleasant now, a gentle, spreading numbness that promised relief from the struggle, an end to the pain. Maybe she could just rest here, just for a moment. Then a cry. It was weak, but insistent. It cut through the thick, inviting fog that was settling over her mind. Grace. Her baby needed her. With a surge of adrenaline born from pure maternal instinct, she pushed herself to her knees, then shakily to her feet. "I'm here, Grace," she gasped, her breath frosting in the air. She checked that the baby was still secure and breathing against her chest. "Mama's not giving up." She forced herself to take another step, and another. The horse had wandered a few feet away and now stood with its head lowered, as exhausted as she was. Hannah didn't have the strength to catch it. She would have to continue on foot, alone. Time lost all meaning. It was just an endless sequence of putting one frozen foot in front of the other. She trudged through the vast, empty, moonlit whiteness, singing softly to Grace, the lullabies her own mother had sung to her, though the wind snatched the words away before they could even form. When her legs began to buckle, she thought of spring meadows and warm kitchens. When her mind grew foggy and dark, she focused on the precious weight against her chest. Then the world tilted sideways, and she was down again. She realized she had fallen only when she felt the deep, seeping cold of the snow through her clothes. This time, rising seemed impossible. Her limbs refused to cooperate. They felt like they belonged to someone else. And Grace. Grace had gone quiet again. Too quiet. No, no, no. Hannah murmured, fumbling with numb, useless fingers to check her daughter's face. In the pale, merciless moonlight, Grace's skin looked blue-white, like porcelain. Her tiny lips were parted. She wasn't moving. Please, God, no. With the very last of her strength, Hannah curled her body around her daughter, trying to share what little, fading warmth she had left. "I'm sorry," she whispered, hot tears freezing on her cheeks. "I'm so sorry, my sweet girl. Mama tried." A distant sound penetrated her fading consciousness. The crunch of snow under hooves. Hallucinations, she thought, a detached part of her mind observing her own death. But then came a voice, a man's voice, deep and urgent, carried on the wind. "Hello, is anyone there?" Hannah tried to call out, but her voice was a mere whisper, lost in the vast, cold silence. The gun. Samuel's gun. She fumbled in her pocket, her fingers barely able to close around the cold metal grip. With a tremendous, final effort that took everything she had left, she raised it, pointed it toward the stars, and pulled the trigger. The sound cracked across the empty landscape like a clap of thunder. "There!" the voice called, much closer now. "Over there! I heard it!" Hoofbeats approached rapidly, a frantic, life-saving rhythm. Then a tall figure on a powerful horse loomed over her. The man dismounted in one fluid, practiced motion. A face, shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat, bent close to hers. "Ma'am? Ma'am, can you hear me?" Hannah couldn't speak. She could only clutch feebly at her coat, trying to communicate the only thing that mattered. "My baby," she gasped. Strong, gentle hands carefully opened her coat, revealing Grace's still, silent form. The man's breath caught, a sharp, audible sound in the night. But when he spoke, his voice remained impossibly steady. "I've got you both," he assured her. He gathered them both into his arms, with a surprising gentleness for such a large man. "My ranch is close. Just hold on." He lifted her onto his horse as if she weighed nothing, mounting behind her, and wrapping them both in a heavy, warm buffalo robe. One strong arm secured her against his broad chest, the other cradled Grace. "Stay with me," he said, his voice a low rumble, his breath warm against her ear as the horse began to move, battling its way through the deep snow. "Both of you, you stay with me." Consciousness faded in and out. Hannah was aware only of the life-giving warmth at her back, the precious, still too quiet bundle against her chest, and the steady rocking motion of the horse. A light appeared in the distance. A single, golden window, a beacon of hope in the endless darkness. Then more lights. A house. When the horse finally stopped, she heard doors opening, other voices calling out, but she couldn't make sense of the words. Strong arms carried her inside, into a wave of blessed, overwhelming warmth. The next thing she knew, she was lying on a soft rug before a roaring fire. A woman's kind, weathered face hovered above her. "Can you hear me, dear?" the woman asked, her voice gentle but firm. "The baby," Hannah croaked, a fresh wave of panic rising as she realized Grace was no longer in her arms. "My baby!" "Your little one's right here," the woman said, stepping aside. Hannah's eyes followed her gesture. A gray-haired man was sitting in a rocking chair nearby, cradling Grace, and to Hannah's immense, soul-shaking relief, the baby was awake. Her tiny mouth was working eagerly at a bottle of warm milk. "Hungry as a bear cub, this one," the man said with a kind, reassuring smile. "But no worse for the wear. You got her here just in time, ma'am. Just in time." Tears of pure, unadulterated relief spilled down Hannah's cheeks, washing away the ice and fear. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." "Don't thank us. Thank Jackson," the woman said, bringing a cup of hot broth to Hannah's lips. "If he hadn't found you when he did." She left the sentence unfinished, but Hannah understood. They had been minutes, maybe seconds, from death in that snow. "Jackson?" she asked, her voice weak. Jackson Reed? The woman nodded. That's him. I'm Margaret Cooper, and that's my husband William, with your little one. We work for Mr. Reed. Hannah took a small sip of the broth, its savory warmth spreading through her chest, chasing away the last of the deep, killing cold. How did he find us? In the dark? In all that snow? Jackson has a sense about things, Margaret said, a hint of awe and admiration in her voice. Says he heard a gunshot and just knew someone was in serious trouble. Hannah remembered firing the revolver with the last of her strength. A miracle he had heard it. An even greater miracle he had found them in that vast, empty whiteness. Rest now, Margaret urged, helping Hannah drink more of the broth. You can talk more tomorrow, when you're stronger. Hannah wanted to ask more questions. She wanted to thank these people properly, to thank the mysterious Jackson Reed. But a heavy, dreamless exhaustion was pulling her under. The last thing she saw before sleep finally claimed her was Grace, her cheeks pink again, safe and warm in William Cooper's gentle, steady hands. She dreamed of Nathan again. But this time, he was standing with his other wife, his arm wrapped possessively around her waist. They were both smiling down at a baby in the woman's arms. When Hannah called out to him, he looked right through her, as if she were a ghost, as if she didn't even exist. The dream shifted, and she was back in the blinding snow, searching desperately, frantically for Grace. A tall figure appeared out of the blizzard, his face shadowed beneath a wide hat. He extended a hand toward her. I've got you, a deep voice said. I've got you both. Hannah woke to sunlight, bright, warm sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows. For a confused moment, she didn't know where she was. Then, the memories flooded back in a sickening rush. The cabin, the men, the lies in Nathan's letter, the desperate freezing journey through the snow. She sat up quickly, her whole body aching. She was in a simply furnished but comfortable bedroom. A beautiful handmade quilt covered her, and her own tattered frozen clothes had been replaced with a soft flannel nightgown several sizes too large. Beside the bed was a wooden cradle. Hannah's heart leaped into her throat. Grace was sleeping peacefully within it, a tiny, perfect angel. The door opened softly, and Margaret Cooper entered, carrying a tray laden with food. Ah, you're awake, the older woman said with a warm, genuine smile. How are you feeling? Better, Hannah said, surprised to find that it was true. Her body ached, and her fingers and toes tingled painfully as circulation fully returned, but the deep, bone-chilling cold was finally gone. How long have I slept? Nearly 2 full days, Margaret said, setting the tray on a small table by the bed. You needed it. You were half frozen when Jackson brought you in. Hannah's gaze returned to her daughter. And Grace? She's a marvel, Margaret said fondly, a twinkle in her eye. Recovered much faster than you did. She's been eating well and sleeping like a little queen. William is completely smitten with her. Relief, so powerful it was almost dizzying, washed over Hannah. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion, for caring for her, for both of us. It's no trouble at all, Margaret assured her, pouring a cup of hot tea from a small pot on the tray. It's been years since we've had a little one around this place. It's a welcome change. Hannah accepted the tea gratefully, its warmth and sweetness reviving her further. Where exactly are we? Reed Ranch, about 30 miles south of Snake Valley. Jackson built it himself after the war, started with nothing but 2 horses and a will of iron. There was an unmistakable pride in Margaret's voice. Now it's one of the finest spreads in the whole territory. Hannah sipped her tea, trying to process this. 30 miles south of Snake Valley. She had traveled even farther than she had realized. No wonder she had nearly perished. I need to thank Mr. Reed, she said. He saved our lives. You'll see him at supper tonight, Margaret replied. He's been asking after you constantly. Worried sick, though he'd never admit it in a million years. She smiled fondly. That's Jackson for you. Heart as big as all outdoors, but he keeps it locked up tighter than Fort Knox. Hannah's curiosity about their enigmatic rescuer grew. Who was this man? Have you and your husband worked for him for a long time? Since the beginning, Margaret said, helping Hannah to a bowl of rich, hearty stew from the tray. William and I met Jackson during the war. I was a nurse. William had important work. She paused, and a strange, unreadable expression crossed her face. We all needed a fresh start after it was all over. There was clearly more to their story, but Hannah didn't press. She had enough secrets of her own to keep. Now, Margaret said briskly, her tone shifting. You should try to eat something. Then maybe a short walk around the house, get your strength back. Doctor's orders. Doctor? Jackson. He was a surgeon in the war. One of the best, they said. He doesn't practice anymore except in emergencies like yours. But he checked you both over thoroughly when you arrived. This matched what Samuel had told her, that Reed had saved Nathan's life. Hannah wondered if this man, her savior, knew that she was Nathan Sinclair's wife. And if he did, had that influenced his decision to ride out into a blizzard to search for them? After she'd eaten and washed up, Hannah dressed in simple, clean clothes Margaret had left for her. Grace was awake now, gurgling happily as Hannah changed and fed her. You're none the worse for our little adventure, are you, my sweet girl? Hannah murmured, kissing her daughter's tiny, perfect fingers. You're tougher than your mama, that's for certain. With Grace held securely in her arms, Hannah ventured out of the bedroom. She found herself in a long hallway with several other doors. The house was larger than she had expected, not lavish, but solidly built and meticulously maintained. The wide plank floors gleamed with beeswax polish, and the walls were whitewashed and clean. She followed the sound of voices to a spacious, warm kitchen where Margaret was kneading bread dough at a large wooden table. William Cooper sat in a chair by the fire, smoking a pipe and reading a well-worn book. There she is, William said, looking up with a warm smile. He was a distinguished-looking man with a full head of silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He didn't look like any ranch hand Hannah had ever seen. And little Miss Grace, too. How are you feeling, dear? Margaret asked, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. Much better, thank you. Hannah felt a strange sense of peace settle over her, the first she'd felt in days. This place, it felt safe. Good, good, William said, setting his book aside. Jackson will be pleased to hear it. He should be back from the north pasture soon. He was checking the herd after the storm. Hannah spent the rest of the afternoon in the warm kitchen, helping Margaret where she could and simply watching William as he read. They were a comfortable, easy pair, and they treated her with a simple kindness that brought tears to her eyes. They asked no prying questions about how she and Grace came to be freezing to death in the wilderness. They just accepted her presence. As evening approached, the back door opened, letting in a gust of cold air. A man stepped inside. He was tall, broader than she'd realized, with the quiet, powerful presence of a man completely at home in his own skin. He took off his wide-brimmed hat, revealing dark hair and a strong, rugged face that was hard to read. His eyes, a startlingly clear gray, found hers across the room. It was him, her rescuer, Jackson Reed. Mrs. Sinclair, he said, his voice the same deep, steady rumble she remembered from the snow. I'm glad to see you're on your feet. Mr. Reed, Hannah replied, her own voice barely a whisper. I don't know how to thank you. You saved my daughter's life. You saved both of us. He just gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, as if saving lives was a common occurrence. Margaret tells me you're feeling better. Yes, thank you. An awkward silence fell. He seemed to be studying her, his gray eyes intense, searching. Hannah felt a sudden, prickling unease. He knew. He had to know who she was. She had to face it. She couldn't live under his roof under false pretenses. "Mr. Reed," she began, her heart starting to pound again. "There's something you should know. My husband, the man you knew in the war, his name is Nathan Sinclair." Jackson Reed's expression didn't change, not a flicker. But the air in the room grew heavy, tense. "I know who he is," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "He told me, in a letter, that you owed him a favor." Hannah pressed on, needing to understand. "That's why I was trying to get here. He said you would help us." Jackson Reed took a step closer. He wasn't menacing, but his sheer size and the sudden intensity in his gaze were overwhelming. "Let me be clear, Mrs. Sinclair," he said, his voice low and cold as a winter river. "Nathan Sinclair was a coward and a deserter. I saved his life at Antietam after he'd thrown down his rifle and tried to run. The only favor I ever did him was not reporting him for it." Hannah stared at him, speechless. This was not the story she was expecting. "He repaid that favor," Jackson continued, his voice laced with a quiet, controlled anger, "by stealing a crate of Army medical supplies, including enough morphine to kill a horse, and vanishing in the night. I don't owe Nathan Sinclair anything, and if he ever shows his face on my land, I will shoot him on sight." Hannah's world, already shattered, was now being ground into dust. The man she had married wasn't just a bigamist and a liar. He was a thief and a coward too. Then why?" she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Why did you come for us?" Jackson Reed's hard expression softened for the briefest of moments. His gaze flickered from her face to the sleeping baby in her arms. "Because I heard a gunshot in a blizzard," he said simply. "And whatever sins the father is guilty of, the child is innocent." He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Hannah standing there, shaking, surrounded by the ruins of her life. Later that night, unable to sleep, Hannah found Margaret Cooper sitting alone by the fire in the main room, mending a shirt. "He hates him," Hannah said, her voice hollow. "He hates Nathan." Margaret looked up from her sewing, her expression full of a deep, sad wisdom. "Jackson doesn't hate easily, child. But Nathan Sinclair, he tested the limits of his charity." Hannah sank into the chair opposite her, the full weight of her situation pressing down on her. "I don't know what to do. I have nowhere to go. Those men, they're still out there. They think Nathan has gold, and they think I know where it is." Margaret put down her sewing, her gaze direct and serious. "Hannah, you need to tell me everything. Who are these men? What exactly did they say?" So Hannah told her. She told her about the 4 men, the scarred one, the vicious short one, and the intelligent, cold-eyed leader. She described their threats, their certainty about a massive gold strike in Snake Valley. As she spoke, she saw a strange look pass between Margaret and William, who had entered the room and was now listening intently. It was a look of recognition and of alarm. "Calloway," William murmured, his voice grim. "It has to be." "Who is Calloway?" Hannah asked. Margaret took a deep breath. It was clear she was about to cross a line to reveal something important. "Hannah, what I'm about to tell you cannot leave this room. William and I, we weren't just a nurse and a worker during the war. We were agents for the Pinkerton Detective Agency." Hannah stared at them, stunned into silence. "Pinkertons?" "We've been out of the life for years," William continued, his voice low and urgent. "We came here with Jackson to start over. But for the last few years, we've been tracking a gang of train robbers. A particularly brutal crew responsible for at least a dozen deaths. Their leader is a cunning, ruthless man named Silas Calloway." "The intelligent man," Hannah whispered, a chill running down her spine. "And their newest recruit," Margaret added, her eyes filled with pity. "The man who supposedly found a way to track the payroll shipments, The man they all trusted was a charming prospector from Virginia. Hannah felt the blood drain from her face. No. Yes, William said, his voice heavy with certainty. The gold in Snake Valley isn't from a mine, Hannah. It's the stolen payroll from the Union Pacific train that was robbed 2 weeks ago. And your husband, Nathan Sinclair, wasn't just their informant. He was the inside man. He planned the whole thing. And then, it seems, he ran off with the entire score himself, double-crossing his own murderous crew. The truth was a physical blow. Her husband wasn't just a liar and a coward. He was a master criminal, the leader of a gang of killers. And now, those killers were hunting him. And they were hunting her. 2 days later, the world came crashing down. They were in the barn, Jackson and William checking on a newborn calf when they saw him. A single rider, sitting on a horse on the ridge overlooking the ranch. He was just watching them, motionless. It was Calloway. "Get Hannah and the baby inside," Jackson said, his voice deadly calm. "Lock the doors, bar the windows. Now." The siege had begun. They didn't attack right away. Calloway was too smart for that. He and his 3 men circled the ranch, staying just out of rifle range. They were testing the defenses, counting the people inside, waiting. The psychological pressure was immense. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like an approaching footstep. Inside the ranch house, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Jackson was no longer a quiet rancher. He was a commander. William, the quiet man who read books, moved with the deadly efficiency of a trained marksman, checking rifles, distributing ammunition. And Margaret, the gentle nurse, was a crack strategist, pointing out weak spots, directing them where to watch. Hannah felt useless, terrified. Her only job was to keep Grace quiet, to shield her from the nightmare that had descended upon them. Late that afternoon, Calloway made his move. He rode forward alone, a white flag tied to his saddle. He stopped 100 yards from the house. "Reed!" he shouted, his voice carrying clearly in the cold, still air. "I know you're in there, and I know you have the woman. This has nothing to do with you. Send her out with what belongs to me, and we'll be on our way. No one else has to get hurt." "Go to hell, Calloway!" Jackson yelled back from an upstairs window. "Wrong answer!" Calloway wheeled his horse around and galloped back to his men. Minutes later, the first shot was fired. A bullet splintered the wood of the window frame right next to Jackson's head. The gunfight had started. For hours they exchanged fire. The crack of rifles echoed across the valley. Calloway's men were good shots, and they used the terrain for cover, moving constantly. But Jackson and William were better. They were disciplined, conserving their shots, making everyone count. Hannah huddled in the cellar with Grace, the safest place in the house. She listened to the thunder of the guns above, praying with every fiber of her being. She felt trapped, a pawn in a deadly game started by the man she had once loved. But then, as she rocked her whimpering baby, her mind, sharpened by fear and desperation, started working. Nathan's letter. The map. He had written, "The enclosed map will lead you there." But the map hadn't been that accurate. She had gotten lost. It was just a crude drawing. Unless it wasn't just a map to the ranch. She pulled the crumpled paper from her pocket. She smoothed it out on the dusty floor of the cellar. There was the path south, the mark for Reed's ranch. But there were other marks, too. Faint pencil lines she had ignored, a drawing of a split rock, a lightning-scarred tree, a series of numbers next to a drawing of what looked like a winding creek. It wasn't just a map. It was a code. And then she saw it. A phrase scribbled in the margin, almost illegible. "Where the serpent sleeps. Snake Valley. The gold wasn't here. It was never here. It was still out there, hidden somewhere in Snake Valley. And this map, this letter, was the key." A crazy, desperate idea began to form in her mind. An idea so dangerous it made her feel sick. But it was the only card she had to play. She waited for a lull in the shooting. Then, holding Grace tight, she ran upstairs. "I know where it is," she said, her voice shaking but clear. Jackson, William, and Margaret all turned to stare at her. "The gold. It's not here. But I think I know how to find it." She explained her idea. They all looked at her like she was insane. "It's a trick," William said flatly. "Calloway will kill you the second you step outside." "It's our only chance," Hannah insisted. "They want the gold, not us. If I can convince them of that, I can lead them away from here. I can buy you time." "Absolutely not," Jackson said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You saved my life, Mr. Reed," Hannah said, meeting his hard gaze. "Now let me try to save yours." Before he could protest further, she walked to the front door, took a deep breath, and shouted, "Calloway, I'll make a deal with you!" The shooting stopped. "I'm listening!" Calloway's voice came back. "The gold isn't here!" she yelled, her voice trembling. "But I know where it is! Let these people go, and I will take you to it!" There was a long silence. Hannah's heart hammered against her ribs. "Just you!" Calloway shouted back. "Come out alone, and we have a deal!" Jackson grabbed her arm. "Hannah, don't! This is suicide!" "It's a chance," she whispered back, pulling the revolver Samuel had given her from her pocket and tucking it into the waistband of her skirt, hidden by her shawl. "Get ready." She handed the sleeping Grace to Margaret, kissed her daughter's forehead, and walked out the front door, her hands raised in the air. She walked 100 feet into the open, her heart in her throat. Calloway and his 3 men rode out to meet her. Calloway's cold eyes studied her, searching for any sign of a trick. "Where is it?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "Hidden, near Snake Valley," Hannah said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Nathan left me a map. A coded map. Only I can decipher it." Calloway's eyes narrowed. He was suspicious, but the greed was stronger. "All right, you ride with me. But if this is a trick, you'll die first, and then everyone in that house dies." As one of the men forced her onto the back of his horse, Hannah risked a glance back at the ranch house. She saw the curtain in the upstairs window move. She knew Jackson, William, and Margaret were watching, and she prayed they understood her plan. She led them north, back into the wilderness. She used Nathan's map, pointing out the landmarks, the split rock, the lightning-scarred tree. She was leading them to the place marked on the map, a place Nathan had described as where the serpent sleeps. An old, abandoned mine shaft, deep in a treacherous canyon in Snake Valley. It was a trap. But not just for Calloway. As they rode, she saw signs, a freshly broken branch, an unnaturally placed stone. Jackson and William were following them, silent and unseen. They reached the canyon at dusk. The entrance to the old mine was a dark, gaping mouth in the side of the rock face. "This is it," Hannah said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's in there." "You first," Calloway ordered, shoving her toward the entrance. Hannah took a step into the darkness, her hand gripping the hidden revolver. And that's when another voice echoed from deep within the mine. "Calloway? Is that you, you son of a bitch?" Everyone froze. Out of the darkness, a figure stumbled forward. He was gaunt, filthy, and his eyes were wide with a desperate, cornered animal fear. It was Nathan. He had been here all along, hiding, waiting for Calloway to give up the search so he could retrieve the stolen loot himself. Calloway's face twisted into a mask of pure, murderous rage. "Sinclair, you thieving rat, I'm going to enjoy this." His men raised their rifles, all their attention now focused on Nathan. And that's the moment Hannah had been waiting for. She pulled the revolver from her skirt and fired, not at Calloway, but at the man closest to her. He cried out and fell from his horse. At the same instant, 2 rifle shots cracked from the rocks high above the canyon. Calloway's other 2 men dropped without a sound. Calloway spun around, his eyes wild with fury and surprise, Just as Jackson Reed stepped out from behind a boulder, his own rifle leveled. The two leaders faced each other. But Calloway wasn't looking at Jackson. He was looking at Nathan, who was trying to scramble back into the darkness of the mine. "You're not getting away!" Calloway screamed, and he lunged not for his gun, but for a rotting wooden support beam at the entrance of the mine. He threw his entire weight against it. There was a deep, groaning sound. The ground shook. Rocks and dirt began to rain down from the mine's entrance. "Nathan!" Hannah screamed, despite everything. But it was too late. With a deafening roar, the entire entrance to the mine collapsed, burying both Nathan and Silas Calloway under tons of rock and earth. Silence descended on the canyon. Hannah stood there, shaking, the revolver still smoking in her hand. William and Jackson climbed down from the rocks. It was over. In the aftermath, they found the stolen payroll in a side tunnel of the collapsed mine that was still accessible. The Coopers officially closed their last case, sending word to the Pinkerton agency. The story given was that the entire Calloway gang, including their mysterious inside man, had perished in a mine collapse while fighting over their loot. Hannah Sinclair and her daughter were never mentioned. Back at the ranch, a strange peace settled. The threat was gone. The ghosts of the past had been buried. One evening, Hannah found Jackson Reed on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. "I don't know what I'll do now," she said quietly. Jackson didn't look at her. He just stared out at the vast, open land that was his home. "This is a big country, Hannah. A good place to start over. There's always a place for you and Grace here, if you want it." It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't a promise of anything more than what it was, an offer of safety, of a home, of a family built not on lies and deceit, but on shared survival and quiet respect. Hannah looked at her daughter, sleeping peacefully in her arms. She looked out at the wide-open Dakota sky. For the first time since she'd left Virginia, she saw a future. A real one. One she would build herself, for herself, and for her daughter. She was no longer Nathan Sinclair's wife or Calloway's victim. She was Hannah, and she had survived. The story of Hannah Sinclair is a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers aren't the monsters lurking in the wilderness, but the ones sleeping right beside you. She faced betrayal, heartbreak, and mortal danger, but through it all, she found a strength she never knew she had, all to protect her child. If you enjoyed this story of survival, betrayal, and ultimate justice, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales from the dark and twisted pages of history. And let me know in the comments below, what would you have done in Hannah's position?